America had broken the Soviet codes, and they kept it secret from everyone for 40 years. 1943, the middle of World War II. The Soviet Union was America's ally, but American intelligence was suspicious. Was the Soviet Union spying on America? The Army Signal Intelligence Service started a project, codename Venona. The goal was to break Soviet diplomatic traffic. It took years. The ciphers were incredibly complex, one-time pads, supposedly impossible to break. But the Soviets had made a mistake. During the war, they reused their cipher pads, and that mistake opened the door. In 1946, the first messages were decrypted. American intelligence was shocked. Soviet spies were everywhere, in the Manhattan Project, in the State Department, in the Treasury, inside the White House. Hundreds of spies, thousands of leaked documents, and America could not tell anyone, because if they did, the Soviets would know the codes had been broken. For 40 years, Venona remained one of the world's best-kept secrets. This is the story of how America discovered the largest Soviet spy network in history, how they watched helplessly as spies escaped justice, and how a secret kept for 4 decades finally revealed the truth about the Cold War's greatest espionage cases. To understand Venona, you must first understand the one-time pad. It is the holy grail of cryptography, a cipher system that is theoretically unbreakable, not difficult to break, not time-consuming to break, mathematically impossible to break if used correctly. The system works like this. Both the sender and receiver have identical pads of random numbers. Each page contains a unique sequence of digits. To encrypt a message, the sender converts each letter to a number, then adds it to the corresponding number from the pad. The result is transmitted. The receiver subtracts the pad numbers to recover the original message. The security comes from randomness. Because the pad numbers are truly random, there is no pattern to detect. Because each page is used only once and then destroyed, there is no repetition to exploit. Without the pad, decryption is impossible. The Soviet Union used one-time pads for their most sensitive communications. Diplomatic cables, intelligence reports, instructions to agents. They believed these messages were completely secure. They were wrong. Not because the mathematics failed, but because the humans did. During World War II, the Soviet Union faced enormous pressure. The German invasion had devastated their infrastructure. Factories were destroyed or evacuated. Supply lines were disrupted. Resources were scarce. Everything was devoted to the war effort. This included the production of one-time pads. The facilities that manufactured the random number sequences could not keep up with demand. There were not enough pads to go around. Someone made a decision. Rather than delay communications, they would reuse some pages. The same random sequences would be printed in multiple pads and distributed to different stations. This was a catastrophic security breach. It meant that messages encrypted with the same page could be compared. And when 2 messages share the same key, mathematical analysis becomes possible. The Soviets did not realize the danger, or perhaps they did not care given the existential threat they faced from Germany. Either way, the mistake was made. Tens of thousands of pages were duplicated. Hundreds of thousands of messages were vulnerable. The unbreakable cipher had been broken by human error. American codebreakers would eventually discover this weakness, but it would take years of painstaking work before the first secrets emerged. The Venona project began in February 1943. Jean Grable, a young woman who had been a schoolteacher just weeks before, was assigned to examine encrypted Soviet diplomatic communications. The Army Signal Intelligence Service had collected thousands of Soviet messages, but had never seriously attempted to decrypt them. The initial goal was modest: study the traffic patterns, identify the communication networks, perhaps learn something about Soviet intentions, even without reading the actual messages. But Grable and her colleagues noticed something: patterns in the encrypted text that should not have been there, repetitions that suggested the one-time pads were not truly one-time. The discovery was promising, but the work was agonizingly slow. The messages were in Russian, a language few American codebreakers knew. The Soviet systems were sophisticated, and even with the pad reuse, breaking the encryption required identifying which messages shared keys and then solving complex mathematical puzzles. In 1946, a brilliant linguist named Meredith Gardner joined the project. Gardner was quiet, scholarly, and possessed an extraordinary mind for languages and patterns. He would become the heart of the Venona effort. Gardner made the first breakthrough. In December 1946, he decrypted a message that contained a list of scientists working on the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb, the most closely guarded secret in American history. The Soviets knew about it. They had spies inside. The decrypted messages painted a terrifying picture. Soviet espionage in America was not a handful of isolated agents. It was a massive, coordinated intelligence operation. Hundreds of sources were mentioned in the Venona traffic. Code names appeared again and again. Liberal, Antenna, Ailes, Homer. Each represented a Soviet spy embedded in American institutions. The spies were everywhere. In the Manhattan Project, where atomic secrets were being stolen. In the State Department, where diplomatic strategies were being leaked. In the Treasury Department, where economic intelligence was being passed. In the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime predecessor to the CIA. Some messages described documents that had been photographed and transmitted to Moscow. Others discussed recruitment of new agents. Still others contained detailed intelligence on American military and political plans. The scale was staggering. American intelligence had known about Soviet espionage, but had never imagined it was this extensive. The Soviet Union had penetrated the American government at every level. But there was a problem. The decrypts could not be used. American intelligence faced an impossible choice. If they used the Venona decrypts to arrest Soviet spies, the Soviets would know their codes had been broken. They would change their systems. The flow of intelligence would stop. Future spies would escape detection. If they kept Venona secret, the spies would continue to operate. More secrets would be stolen, more damage would be done. But the long-term intelligence value would be preserved. They chose secrecy. The Venona project was classified at the highest level. Only a handful of people knew it existed. The FBI was eventually brought in, but even most FBI agents were kept in the dark. The CIA was not told until years later. Presidents Truman and Eisenhower may never have been fully briefed. This secrecy had consequences. Soviet spies who could have been arrested remained free. Some continued to operate for years. Others escaped to the Soviet Union before they could be caught. And perhaps most painfully, some people were prosecuted for espionage without the government being able to reveal its best evidence. The Venona decrypts would have proven guilt beyond any doubt, but they could not be used in court. They could not even be shown to judges or juries. The secret that could have ended Soviet espionage instead became a secret that protected it. No case illustrates the Venona dilemma more tragically than the Rosenbergs. Julius Rosenberg was a committed communist who had been recruited by Soviet intelligence in the late 1930s. He ran a network of agents who stole military and industrial secrets. His codename in the Venona traffic was Liberal. His wife Ethel was aware of his activities and assisted in his espionage work, though her direct involvement was less than her husband's. Both were arrested in 1950, following the confession of another spy, David Greenglass, Ethel's brother. The case became an international sensation. The Rosenbergs were accused of stealing atomic bomb secrets and passing them to the Soviet Union. They maintained their innocence throughout. Supporters around the world protested. Pleas for clemency flooded the White House. The Venona decrypts proved Julius Rosenberg's guilt conclusively. Messages described his activities in detail. His codename appeared repeatedly. The evidence was overwhelming. But it could not be used. The prosecution had to rely on witness testimony, much of it from co-conspirators seeking reduced sentences. The case was strong, but not airtight. Reasonable people could doubt. On June 19, 1953, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed by electric chair. They were the only American civilians executed for espionage during the Cold War. For 40 years, their guilt remained disputed. Only when Venona was declassified in 1995 did the full truth emerge. Julius Rosenberg had been exactly what the government claimed, a Soviet spy who betrayed his country. Another famous case was Alger Hiss. Hiss was the embodiment of the American establishment. Harvard Law School graduate, clerk for Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, rising star in the State Department, advisor to President Roosevelt at Yalta, Secretary General of the United Nations Founding Conference. In 1948, a former communist named Whittaker Chambers accused Hiss of being a Soviet agent. Chambers claimed he had received classified documents from Hiss in the 1930s and passed them to Soviet intelligence. Hiss denied everything. He denied knowing Chambers. He denied any communist involvement. He denied ever engaging in espionage. The case divided America. Many saw Hiss as a victim of anti-communist hysteria. Others saw him as a traitor who had betrayed his country while enjoying its highest honors. A young congressman named Richard Nixon made his reputation pursuing the Hiss case. Nixon was convinced Hiss was lying. He pushed the investigation relentlessly. Hiss was eventually convicted of perjury for denying his relationship with Chambers. He served nearly 4 years in prison, but the espionage charge itself was never proven in court. The Venona Decrypts told a different story. A Soviet agent codenamed Ailes appeared in the traffic. The description matched Hiss perfectly. Ailes was a State Department official who had attended the Yalta Conference and traveled to Moscow afterward. When Venona was declassified, the evidence pointed directly at Hiss. The spy he denied being was documented in Soviet communications. Nixon had been right all along. Venona revealed something else disturbing. Soviet penetration of British intelligence, who was providing extremely valuable information. The Americans grew increasingly concerned. They shared some Venona intelligence with their British counterparts, carefully, without revealing the full extent of the program. The British had their own suspects. A diplomat named Donald Maclean had been acting strangely. He drank too much. He seemed nervous. He had access to highly classified information. Venona helped confirm the suspicions. Maclean's codename was Homer. He had been a Soviet agent since the 1930s, recruited while at Cambridge University. But Maclean was not alone. He was part of a ring that would become known as the Cambridge Five. 5 young men, all recruited at Cambridge, all placed in positions of power, all working for Moscow. Kim Philby was the most damaging. He rose to become head of the Soviet section of MI6, British Foreign Intelligence. The man responsible for catching Soviet spies was himself a Soviet spy. He had access to virtually every secret the West possessed. When Maclean came under suspicion, Philby warned him. Maclean and another Cambridge spy, Guy Burgess, fled to Moscow in 1951. They disappeared behind the Iron Curtain. Philby remained under suspicion, but was not conclusively exposed until 1963, when he too defected to Moscow. The damage he had done over 2 decades was incalculable. The most devastating Venona revelations concerned the atomic bomb. Klaus Fuchs was a German-born physicist who had fled Nazi Germany and settled in Britain. He was recruited to work on the Manhattan Project, first in Britain and then in the United States. He had access to the most sensitive secrets of atomic weapon design. He was also a Soviet agent. Fuchs provided Moscow with detailed technical information about the atomic bomb. His intelligence allowed the Soviets to accelerate their own nuclear program by years. The Soviet bomb, tested in 1949, owed much to Fuchs's espionage. Venona helped identify Fuchs as a spy. His codename was Charles. The Decrypts described his meetings with Soviet handlers and the information he provided. Fuchs was arrested in Britain in 1950. He confessed and served 9 years in prison before being released to East Germany. But Fuchs was not alone. Theodore Hall was another Manhattan Project physicist who spied for the Soviets. His code name was M-Lad. Unlike Fuchs, Hall was never prosecuted. The Venona evidence was too sensitive to use, and without it, the case could not be proven. Hall lived freely until his death in 1999. He eventually admitted his espionage, but expressed no regret. He believed he had helped prevent American nuclear monopoly and thereby saved the world from destruction. For decades, Venona remained secret. The project continued throughout the Cold War, with cryptanalysts working to decrypt additional messages. By the time it ended, roughly 43,000 Soviet messages had been at least partially decrypted. They covered the period from 1942 to 1945, when the pad reuse was most common. But the intelligence community refused to acknowledge the project existed. When suspects denied espionage, the government could not reveal its evidence. When historians debated Cold War spy cases, they did so without knowing the truth. This created a strange situation. People who had been definitively identified as Soviet spies in classified documents continued to maintain their innocence publicly. Their supporters continued to believe them. The historical record remained distorted. Some officials grew frustrated with the secrecy. They wanted to reveal Venona, to prove once and for all that Soviet espionage had been real and extensive. But the intelligence community resisted. Sources and methods had to be protected. The precedent of revealing cryptographic successes was too dangerous. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed, and still Venona remained classified. Finally, in 1995, the National Security Agency began releasing Venona decrypts. The 40-year secret was finally revealed. The release of Venona transformed our understanding of Cold War espionage. Cases that had been debated for decades were suddenly resolved. Alger Hiss was guilty. Julius Rosenberg was guilty. The Soviet espionage network had been exactly as extensive as the government claimed, perhaps more so. For some, Venona was vindication. Anti-communists who had warned about Soviet penetration were proven right. Security officials who had been accused of paranoia were shown to have been understating the threat. For others, Venona raised troubling questions. Why had the government kept this secret for so long? Why had it allowed guilty people to maintain their innocence and innocent people to wonder? Why had it prosecuted some spies while letting others go free? The human cost of Venona's secrecy is impossible to calculate. The Rosenbergs might still have been executed even with full evidence, but the case against them would have been clearer. The public might have understood the true extent of Soviet espionage, rather than dismissing it as hysteria. Perhaps most significantly, Venona revealed how vulnerable democratic societies are to espionage. The Soviet spies came from all backgrounds: scientists and diplomats, government officials and military officers, people who had access to secrets and chose to betray them. The Cold War is over, but the lessons of Venona remain relevant. Intelligence services still try to break codes. Spies still try to steal secrets. Governments still face the dilemma of using intelligence without revealing sources. Venona was a triumph of code-breaking. It was also a tragedy of secrecy. The truth was known but could not be told, and for 40 years that silence shaped history. That is the legacy of America's longest-kept secret.